real quick, we'll move on to Chives for the last question.
Yes, and thanks so much. I'm glad to be here.
So why I wanted to have you on the pod today is to really discuss how the traditional markets work. And specifically, a topic that is very dear to you is the DRS. So I'd love to know what is DRS, and why one should care about DRS.
I'm a huge proponent of blockchain tech, so we can connect on that, and the audience and I connect on that. And I think one of the major things that blockchain or crypto investors have learned over the years, which maybe was right there in the white paper when when Bitcoin was first kind of launched, but only became readily apparent to people later, is that you need custodial control if you want to have protection over your assets. We've seen over the last decade and a half many different exchanges that were operating with crypto meet solvency problems or regulatory problems, and then for one reason or another, people are not able to fully gain all of their assets back. And if you are familiar with the space and you're familiar with technology, you know that's because, and this is embodied in a key phrase that I know everyone knows, not your keys, not your coins, right? Essentially, if you don't have that custodial control, you don't own the asset. You're operating under this, terms and conditions where you're trusting some other custodian to operate on your behalf, probably to provide you with something. Maybe it's access to liquidity, maybe it's access to margin, maybe it's convenience. But point being, you're sacrificing your immediate custodial privileges for these other benefits. And that, I think, is, even today, maybe not fully dawned for a lot of people, but it's becoming more and more penetrated into the collective consciousness. So why do I bring all that up, right? And that brings me to DRS. An incredible fact about the markets, and I think we'll have to dive into this more, but I'll just give an overview now. An incredible fact about the U.S. financial markets, as in, these public markets where stocks are traded. You've got your opening bell, your closing bell. All these people trying to buy and they're selling all this, right? What's incredible? Most of these people operate through a broker. The broker is similar to the crypto broker. They are helping you access liquidity, helping you access margin, providing you benefit. But crucially and similarly, you are sacrificing custodial control when you are using a broker. And DRS stands for the Direct Registration System. It's and we'll get into more details about the structure later, but essentially it's a opt-in opportunity for retail investors who are involved in the U.S. stock market to willingly take that take that custody for themselves and list those shares under their own name, which comes with a variety of benefits, comes with a variety of drawbacks, but essentially it's a different method of holding that allows for you to have that self-custodial control. So in the same vein as not your key, not your coins, at YDRS, we've got on some of our advertising, we say, not your name, not your shares. Because if your name, rather than some other custodian's name, is not listed on your shares, you don't have that custodial control. So as to what YDRS is, it's a operating DUNA, which stands for Decentralized, Unincorporated Nonprofit Association. Essentially, we are seeking to provide educational resources for not just American investors, but anyone around the world that's investing in the U.S. markets to realize that they, number one, don't have custody innately, and number two, that they have the choice to seek custody if they would like it, and number three, what the pros and cons of that are.
Thank you, Chives, for explaining what DRS is. But let's get into the interesting bits here, because I think this comparison, like outside of perhaps few people that have listened on YouTube, most people really don't connect not your keys, not your coins to what's currently happening in the traditional markets, right? Because I think mostly operate in silos. So the people operating in traditional markets hardly actually come to the crypto world. We're talking about equities, right? Here, are we talking about equities, bonds, or any other financial assets on the traditional markets that could be DRS? Because I think that's very. Let's just go through in defining what are the parameters here.
Sure. So specifically, DRS is referring to shares, as in when a publicly traded company is operating in the market, they have some number of shares that they're issuing into the market. Let's call it 1 million, right? And those shares are what you would be able to move through this DRS, which is this two-way street kind of thing where you can move from that major custodial system at the series of interoperating brokerages into your own name where you're directly registered on the issuer's ledger, which is maintained by a company that they're contracting typically. As far as other investment vehicles, things like bonds or options, most of the time there's going to be some kind of underwriter. There's going to be some kind of other side of the trade. It's possible in some cases where you could, let's say well, here, I'll get to that in a second. So typically when you're involving yourself at a broker through any of these, broadly speaking, we could call derivative investments, it's not going to be possible to direct register anything because it's not that there's an underlying asset so much as there's a understanding of an equity relationship that you're a part of. So that's maybe the distinction I try to draw there. When it comes to a company, let's say that they are doing an at-the-market offering of some kind, or they're seeking to raise funds. Now, selling shares into the market, issuing new shares and selling them into the market is not the only way they can do that. They can also sell things, a variety of other things like units or bonds or preferred shares or public stock options. There's a bunch of different vehicle types. And sometimes it might be possible to, as an individual, get into a relationship with the company directly. So in that sort of way, you'd be avoiding some of those intermediaries, but it still would not be the same as a direct registered holding.
I got it. No, thank you for explaining that. Okay, so this is the DRS side. Now let's pull back a bit, right? And I had a previous session with John Wooten, and we went over the market mechanics side, right? So I'm going to actually pose the same question to you. Why do we care as investors, as retail investors?
Why might an individual be interested to consider this type of holding? And I think that's a terrific question. That's really what most people should be asking for. What's in it for me? Why do I care about this? Right? And ultimately, although myself and YDRS, we pride ourselves in providing a lot of educational information about different types of holdings, it's not that we're trying to say that, DRS is the only way that makes sense to hold or anything like that. Some investors and some situations may be better to utilize the liquidity and margin access, for example, of the traditional brokerage system. So I guess to kind of speak to some of those pros, I mean, it depends on how much time we can give each one. Because the first one that always comes to my mind comes to shareholder democracy, to voting. So shareholder democracy and voting is the first thing that comes to mind often for me. Now, to speak a bit about that, to kind of give an overview, right? When you are a shareholder, you get to involve yourself in shareholder democracy, right? Owning a stock comes with multiple different rights, not just economic rights, but voting rights as well. And when you are, if any folks listening, or if yourself on Key, if you've invested in U.S. companies before, then you know that every year they have what's called an annual general meeting. And typically there are a non-zero number of proposals that are up for a vote. And every shareholder has the opportunity to cast a vote for, yay, nay, whatever it might be, on those proposals. Now, if you are holding through a broker, that broker is going to send out to you what's called a proxy. They're going to gather the voting information from you, and then, through a process which I will elaborate on shortly, pass that on to the, if there's a proxy tabulation company, then they'll pass it on to them. Sometimes there isn't. It'll go right to the transfer agent, which is the company that tracks the issuer ledger and is responsible for paperwork and bookkeeping and all sorts of things regarding ownership. Now that's fine. And if you are a direct registered shareholder, conversely, you can vote directly. You vote for your share that is yours, and you can know with complete confidence, because there's no intermediary, that your vote was not only cast, but that it was counted. And
So Chives, are you saying that if I'm with a broker and I am voting for a annual shareholder meeting, right, AGM, my vote could be modified by the broker?
well, I wouldn't use exactly those words, but
Okay.
but you're astutely noticing that because I'm highlighting that your vote is going to be counted when you're a DRS, that there must be something else going on otherwise. And I think I'll take two more steps back real quick just to briefly talk about kind of this phenomenon that exists in the U.S. market that many folks may be aware of, many folks may not be aware of, but it's essentially quite normal in the U.S. market for there to be more shares trading of a company than that company has actually issued themselves. And this can happen for a variety of different reasons. It can happen for totally legal reasons that are not any necessary cause for concern or like regulatory oversight, but it's essentially a known quantity that is happening for every publicly traded U.S. company. Some of the reasons this can happen, in short, I didn't mean that pun, but one of the things that can happen with shorting, legal shorting involving locates, is let's say party A wants to short a share, and they organize a borrow through like their broker. That broker just maybe pulls it out of the account, accounts for it using someone that has a margin enabled, perhaps, and they don't need to notify them that share is being located for that short. And then while that short is out and active, the AGM record date comes along. Both the person with the share who was located by the broker and the person who took the short out, and then the person who bought that short gets that vote, and the person who originally had the share also is entitled to that vote. So that's 2 votes for 1 share.
And it's all normal. It's allowed in according
Totally
to
normal.
practices.
Totally normal, yes.
Yeah.
And briefly, I'll just say it gets basically infinitely crazy because the person who took that share from the shorter, sold it. This person C can then use that share to short as well if they wanted to, or another way lend that share, and then that new borrower is getting a vote too. So it's this essentially there's a lot of votes flying around. So what happens?
The rehypothecated share. So the prime brokers have located the share, someone borrowed it, and then now you can have that same share could be borrowed twice, rehypothecated, right?
It can be, yes, and this could theoretically happen ad infinitum, and there's really no way to know, even if you were to disable margin on your brokerage account, or even if you were not exposed to that brokerage at all, it could still be happening in other places, or essentially there's not a lot of transparency here. And what will happen, so I mentioned earlier that the broker will, they have an obligation to pass on the voting packet and to solicit voting information from everyone that has a right to vote. But then what they will do is use some kind of truncation process to, when they're passing on to the proxy tabulation company, they'll do some kind of process which can vary from broker to broker. There's not a ton of, they don't have to do it one specific way, but maybe let's say that there are that they have 200 share entitlements out to their clients. That's what I'd refer to, as the numbers in the accounts at a broker are more entitlements than they are shares. Let's say they got 200 share entitlements out, but only 100 of those represent what they should be holding via their membership at CD & Co., which is, we haven't brought that up yet, but I know it was covered in John's episode, so we'll push past it for now. essentially, right? So that's like twice as many votes. And let's say, amazingly, there's 100% voter turnout. Awesome. Well, at that point, it's pretty easy. What the broker could do is truncate the votes, just say, okay, we'll divide the yays in half, we'll divide the nays in half, send that along, and proportionally, it's the same. Like if the vote was held here, it would be accurate. But of course, that's not going to be quite reflective of the whole voting populace of people that are invested in that company.
It's sort of sampling that they do based on unknown mechanisms.
Right. And if the broker had a vested interest in the outcome of a vote one way or the other, then, and I'd love to be wrong about this, but I'm not aware of any forcing mechanism to make sure that they do keep things in that kind of rosy example where they try to keep the reflection, the democratic reflection of their clients in mind. So that's a whole mess.
How do the brokers align the incentives with the customer versus their own internal incentives, right? We do not have any disclosures.
Yeah, I wouldn't speculate as to that, but I would just say that, as I mentioned, I'm not aware of strict regulation ensuring that they are trying to push forward the same voting result that their clients had indicated. And even if they were doing that, it would still not be indicative of the broader voting population, because, you know, if you're a DRS shareholder and you cast your vote and you know that it was counted, you know, that's one share, one vote. But if you're in that example I mentioned before, where, you know, even in that rosy example, it would be that one was 2 shares, 1 vote. And so that is a huge concern if you're an investor who is interested in having a relationship with a company, watching it grow over time, investing in the long haul, especially if you're, you know, like in some kind of tax advantaged long-term investment vehicle or like a pension. I mean, it's unfortunate that the people who are on the longest term, the most exposed, the most assured to be affected by the outcome of these votes, actually have their influence minimized. That's the first big advantage.
Yeah, so that's the first one that really, I mean, it should get your blinders up, right? If you weren't aware of this. What are the other things in your list?
Sure. Well, to carry on kind of with the same context about AGMs and shareholder democracy, the second really important benefit of DRS is the ability to more directly submit shareholder proposals or ideas to the board for consideration in future AGMs or future decision-making processes. If you are DRS, there's a very simple threshold that you need to reach. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have it, but I wrote a extensive, like 15-page guide on how to submit a proposal over at YDRS that folks can go check out. But point being, if you're direct registered, you meet the investment threshold, and you have the formatting correct, then you can submit a proposal. You're allowed to submit 1 per company per year. Every investor is able to do this. What's incredible, though, Ankit, is that, you know, there's thousands of publicly traded companies. There are millions and millions of people invested in the stock market. The amount of proposals that the SEC notes that companies receive, this is crazy. Every proposal is, you know, publicly available on SEC's website, and we're talking less than 500 every year for the last 50 years. You know,
That's
and
crazy,
there are so many investors, but nobody is utilizing this ability. And do you know why? It may have something to do with, if you're not DRS and you want to submit a proposal, then you actually need to get the involvement and consent from everyone else in the custodial chain. So that means your broker. That means you know, your brokers, like if they've got a clearinghouse. That means the folks at DTC. People need to be involved and just sign off. Like, okay, yeah, this is the guy. You know, he's on our records as being a beneficial owner, so he does meet the ownership thresholds. Now, that's all that it really is.
Crazy. That's crazy. I was not personally aware of that, but that's amazing to hear that you can't even submit a proposal and you have to go through the whole hierarchy of things.
You have to involve these guys because remember, if you're not DRS, the company doesn't know your name. They don't know who you are. They don't know you exist. You can send them a letter when you're DRS and they can say, oh, hey, it's that guy. Yeah, he's right here on the list. But if you're not, then you could just be anyone sending a proposal. So it makes good sense. It makes perfect legal regulatory sense why these other entities have to be involved. But what it ends up being is a roadblock to when people want to actually submit something, to have to go through all these other processes and rely on those entities getting back to them in a timely fashion when the submission window is already, only a few months long.
In crypto world, right, you have EIPs on the Ethereum side, Ethereum improvement proposals. On Kaspa side, you have similar things where, anyone can propose anything essentially to improve the protocol, right? So you're saying if you were to do that as a shareholder, as a legal as a beneficiary shareholder, you are not allowed to do that. I mean, you can do it, but you just have to go through all the brokerage approvals and everything, and then
you have to involve those other custodians. And I mean, you can submit without doing that; it'll just get thrown out. It won't have met the standard that is needed. So that's really the way that I'd suggest to phrase it. I mean,
right?
I don't believe that it's like a nefarious thing in this context, because again, like, the company does not know anyone that's holding at a insert broker's name here. They don't know those people exist with those holdings. They don't know that they meet the certain thresholds that they need to meet, and so it makes sense that they would need to throw those proposals out.
When did this whole DRS direct registration start? Is it a new thing? Like, why now all of a sudden we are hearing this? In 2022, when I heard it first time, and obviously we're discussing this in 2024. Why is such a new thing if the traditional markets aren't new?
I thought, DRS is not anything necessarily new. The advent of the centralized depository in the U.S. markets was, in my thinking, like, I wasn't alive at that time, but as a student of history reading about that time, I think that it was a good idea in the moment. And they had a lot of problems in terms of just sheer paperwork. It was inefficient. It was just beset with robberies and accounting problems. And the idea that you could house everything in a single place, and that way you'd suddenly overnight enable the trading of these stock certificates, but on the other side of the country, in on another coast, you could just really speed things up. And I mean, back then, the settlement time was over a week. Today we're down to a day. It's in no small part thanks to the efficiencies created by that system. That's not to say, however, that it doesn't have its downsides, as we've elucidated in the last few minutes. But as far as context goes, I do think that's important. And then as far as DRS is specifically what's called, it's a book entry system. And book entry, I think this is a term that maybe a lot of folks don't know, but essentially all that it means is electronically certificated. So rather than having a piece of paper that denotes a stock certificate, a book entry certificate is electronically recorded. That's all. And starting from, the central depository, when they first started out, they had warehouses, full of certificates. They even started using things called jumbo certificates, which were pieces of paper worth like 100,000 shares. But they still had to have the paper because that was how the laws were written. And so slowly they started to move through this process, which is called dematerialization. And that's a great word for it, because essentially what they were trying to get away from is all this cost associated with trying to store all this paper. Because you don't realize until you think about it, but like these huge warehouses, climate control, organization, it's cumbersome to track. And if you could do it in a way that was electronic, then that would be a lot better. And so the book entry kind of movement started to really take off. So DRS evolved as a way for individuals to hold their securities directly while keeping them in that dematerialized system. And perhaps most importantly, not just to hold them directly, but to move them back and forth. If you are holding like a certificate and you want to reinsert that into the brokerage system to access liquidity or something like that. It's complicated. You have to get what's called a medallion stamp. You have to go to a certified bank or go to an office of that brokerage. You got to maybe sometimes mail it to the transfer agent or have them mail to the transfer agent. It can take weeks. It's not liquid, which is fine. It's not trying to be. It's a piece of paper. But DRS is, although not as liquid as a brokerage, significantly easier to move back into that system if someone desired it. So that was kind of the vacuum space that it was filling. And just to mention that we do have an article on the ydrs.org as well about the history and development of the direct registration system that pulls in large part from some podcast appearances by Dr. Suzanne Trimbath, who was one of the initial people brainstorming and its implementation in the 80s and early 90s and stuff. So that would be the most complete place to get more information.
Yeah, no, perfect. No, that was a very, very good summary. But I want to go back a bit. I think I want to come to ydrs.org and discuss what it is, when it got started. But just a step back to wrap my head around this whole DRS itself. So when it started, right, is it fair to say it was supposed to be, and it was meant to be, for bigger investors, like investors that have, because obviously there are two sides of investment, right? Well, there are many sides, but there's institutional investors. There are individuals that might be sitting on the board that hold the bigger positions. Then we have mostly the discussion here. I think we're talking about retail investor. So was DRS started for institutions to hold? What was the history behind that? Because I think, as my previous question was, in 2024 we're discussing that when it's been around for the last 30, 40 years.
They probably did not necessarily have retail investors at the forefront of their minds, but maybe they would have had, for example, one thing that comes to mind is employee stock plans. Items where employees are getting provided stock directly by the company is a lot more convenient for the employees and for the company if DRS
makes total
exists,
sense.
Right? Because otherwise you'd be getting certificates in the mail, have to keep them in a safe, pain in the butt for everyone. DRS saves quite a lot on postage and on maintenance. So from that perspective, I mean, does that count as thinking about retail, or is that thinking about issuers? I'm not sure. As far as institutionals, yeah, I mean, you're right. That always has been, still is today, a huge proportion of the investing equity that exists in the market. And broadly, I'm not sure that. I think it would really depend one by one about their portfolios, how involved they are as direct holders. These days, even the largest, like BlackRock and Vanguard and so on, those major funds are themselves wrapped up in the CD & Co super system. So, yes, funds have the option to invest directly. LLCs, anything that can hold an equity can hold directly. It doesn't have to be a person with a name. It can be a company with a name as well. But from what I've seen, generally speaking, those institutions are not holding directly in that way. They have sometimes they have additional restriction on them, or they have to meet different types of disclosure requirements. For example, if you're holding over 5%, you got to file a 13G. That is intended for beneficial holders, and usually those folks end up needing to involve themselves with the DTCC because they don't want to. My thinking is, and this part's speculation, it's to help protect market active.
Yeah, liquidity for the markets, right? That's what you say. Yeah.
Long story short. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
And then to finally get around to what you were trying to ask, over 3.5 years ago now, incredibly, but for anyone that wasn't paying attention at that time and somehow hasn't read anything about it, long story short, there were a handful of stocks which were experiencing some idiosyncratic pricing, essentially, up and down by huge percents, unusual and unexplainable. looking at the fundamentals of those companies, and until this all it all culminated in the single moment where many stocks, they went upwards hundreds of percent, to the point that for, I want to say, about 50 different securities, Robinhood and their clearinghouse, Apex, and essentially they shut off the buy button, meaning that they would not allow for retail orders to be filled if they were trying to buy those securities. And that helped to cool things off, and we'll say
Brought the order back to the system, right? The way
well, it brought the order back by taking it away. Yeah,
taking it away, which is opposite of how it should be.
right. Well,
So okay. So the answer is that I was looking for is because certain things happened in 2021 that led to people realizing there is a need and a hole that hasn't been filled properly by the brokerage, and that led to this whole movement that is why we're discussing now. So then the obvious next question for me is, what is DRS.org, and when did you guys start it? And is it because you were yourself there at that time in 2021, seeing what was happening, and you were like, okay, I need to start with other folks here? What led to the creation of DRS.org?
Sure. Well, I guess to answer your question, the last thing you said first, I was there. I was not invested in any of the stocks that were affected at that time, but I was paying attention. There had been volatility in that space and speculation in that space for weeks and weeks beforehand. So if you were paying any attention to that sector, then you're kind of aware. And then when that happened, I mean, myself personally, I was caught completely off guard. I was not at that time aware of any of these things. I'd never heard of DRS at that time, and I had not heard still of DRS until a few months later, when I learned about it from someone else's Reddit post online and started to do my own digging. As far as that went, I was heavily involved in some online communities. Following that, I was involved with the GameStop community and trying to help push DRS advocacy there. We did our best work at that time to provide easy access resources so that people could learn about it, because I guess just to bridge the gap a little bit between, what all happened in January and then why DRS seemed to be important, is that, all these brokers had such control. They had such control, and people didn't realize that there wasn't this, that they didn't have that innate control themselves. It wasn't clear to them now in the way that it's clear to many folks today, and that we're trying to make it clear to more folks in the future. And I had a history as an enthusiast of various blockchain tech for years before that. And so once the dots were connected that it was a custody issue, I became, in a split second, fully committed to wanting to make sure that folks understood these distinctions. And
so you understood the need for DRS and why it fills that gap that the brokerages had.
Yeah, I think that it was my background with blockchain as an enthusiast, and I was that allowed me the ability to kind of quickly discern that. I think that there were understandably a lot of folks that were skeptical, since it was this thing that no one had ever heard of, that seemed awfully niche. But over time, I think that we started to discover more and more benefits. For example, the voting rights, the proposals that I mentioned before, which isn't even like an exhaustive list of possible benefits. But again, I mean, there are negatives as well, negatives that made people reluctant to switch over. Things like, again, the access to margin, access to liquidity are meaningfully impacted when you move outside of the brokerage system. So, some people are like, well, that just seems crazy. I want to be able to, I want to be able to use my investment to help me trade in the derivative market, and I can't do that if I DRS, so it doesn't make any sense for me, and that's fine. But anyway, as far as the impetus eventually behind DRS, it came for me essentially from the realization that it's wonderful, that GameStop and AMC, BBBY, these other meme stocks. There's a good list of them that they were familiar with DRS, that they were starting to learn about it. But that's still a drop in the bucket compared to the 10,000 plus active public tickers that are on U.S. exchanges today. And not only is it a drop in the bucket in terms of tickers, it's like an extra small drop in the bucket in terms of the market cap impact of custody, of what we're talking about here. Like so much of retail's equity is wrapped up in this centralized securities depository. 99.99, who knows? I don't know. Huge percentage of it, right? And that's really unfortunate, just because those individuals, and not to get too far afield, but those individuals could perhaps better be backing up their own interests if they had the ability to learn about, have easy access to educational resources regarding these ownership distinctions, and they can make a decision about a choice that they probably did not realize that they had. And that's really the impetus here. And so it's been a great privilege to be working with a bunch of other volunteers. We're a nonprofit, completely, like, we don't even have donations available right now. We're waiting to get that approved with the IRS. So keep your eyes peeled on that one. But we'll be operating completely transparently, everything on GitHub, looking for community involvement, and just really trying to provide a holistic community resource that is information first and information only, and not trying to be an influence necessarily on how people are choosing to invest, just making sure that they have all the information so that they can invest in the way that they want to. And that's the driving thesis in my perspective. And
what is your vision for ydrs.org
right now? Just to be super specific, and I think I touched on this briefly earlier, but YDRS is filed as a DUNA, or a Decentralized Unincorporated Nonprofit Association. It's actually a new legal entity structure. YDRS has the honor of being the first to file in America.
That's Wyoming, right? That's the state of Wyoming.
The state of Wyoming, and they're the only state so far to have this type of structure. And we were the first one to file and be approved under their statute. So that's an exciting thing. And essentially, what that means, in the title, right? So decentralized means there's no central operating area. It is operated by its community. We're going to be utilizing a DAO framework for that. It is also nonprofit, meaning that we're not seeking to draw profit. It's going to be continually reinvested back into the organization itself, and the way that it will be reinvested and how that'll be distributed are also going to be items that the DAO has influence on as a community of individuals seeking to better market resources and access. And as far as the shape that those resources take, at the moment, we have a variety of different guides. I mentioned things like the stockholder proposal guide. So that's one item that we've got on there. We also have some other things like how to submit an SEC comment, how to submit an SEC petition. These are other ways that everyday investors they have the freedom to directly interact with the regulatory body. But a lot of people, the vast majority of people, they don't take advantage of this right that they have because they are not aware of it, and because the submission process, admittedly, is a little bit archaic. But we try to make it as easy as possible, and so that's one part. We also are working on a volunteer-sourced database of all publicly traded companies, including not only key static information like company name and CIK and address, but also more transitory information, things like how many outstanding shares do they have, what kind of market cap do they have, or what their transfer agent is, and then importantly, from that, eventually we'd like to have DRS guides for every transfer agent and every broker, because although your ability to DRS is a protected right that you have as a U.S. investor, unfortunately, there is not strict regulation about the timeline and process by which that DRS ability is provided to you. So some brokers make it quite easy, some brokers make it quite difficult. Some transfer agents have sophisticated UIs and some don't. And for that reason, we need to have kind of a diverse blend of different instructional information to make sure that people can navigate that miasma successfully. And we have a terrific group of volunteers that are building that resource. And some of this information is available online in other places, but they want you to pay for it. And that's not what we're about. So we're doing as much as possible, like scraping using code that we've built, stuff that is on the GitHub, scraping Edgar filings, making sure that stuff comes from the primary sources and is in a readable, accessible way.
So, Chives, moving our discussion forward, right? But before I get there, I wanted to just highlight one of the points you mentioned that the overall DRS movement is growing, right? We can actually all agree. Very small in terms of relative percentage, but I think one of the numbers I saw was there's around 172,000 GameStop investors that
Something like
actually
that.
are. Yeah, I think around that number, or around 200,000, somewhere between those two numbers were DRS'd, which is a huge number, right? Just to move this discussion forward, you guys did an interview with Chairman Gary Gensler.
Yes.
Love to hear, what was that interview about?
Some background, that interview was set up by fellow advocacy group We the Investors. Essentially, they are a DC-based advocacy group that would draft proposals for different amendments to SEC rules, and then kind of petition style, gather a whole bunch of public support, and then forward those along to the SEC as a way to indicate that they felt these things needed review. And as the years have gone by, some of the items that were in the proposal letters, which We the Investors drafted, have been amended into the rule book, which by and large, I think that they're good amendments. I'm not going to go lie, but yeah. The point being, they were doing good work at that time, and for that reason, they had the opportunity to set up a meeting with Chairman Gensler. This actually was their second meeting with Chairman Gensler, and as they were leading into this second meeting, they were aware of our team's work with DRS advocacy in the GameStop community with the drsgme.org website in the previous months, and they knew that we were building towards YDRS, and essentially they were like, hey, we'd love to have you guys on to speak with Chairman Gensler so that we can try to address some of the DRS questions that are popular in the community. And that was a wonderful opportunity to have extended out. So I appreciate that. As far as the actual meeting itself, it was a collection of different folks on that call. I think it was maybe 6 or 7 community representatives. I don't remember exactly, but everyone just kind of popping on for a bit.
This is 2022, right?
Oh, yeah, this was, I want to say, February 22nd, 2022, okay, which I remember because it's so many twos. And the funny anecdote that I wanted to share is that we had been trying to formally launch YDRS since the beginning of 2022, but we had been having the most horrible DNS issues, and it was arduous, and we did not think we were going to be able to launch it until finally the site stabilized like 3 hours before the call with Chairman Gensler. So it was just in the nick of time.
That's beautiful. At least it was up and running that time.
Oh yeah, well we had the t-shirts ready to go. I'm wearing this same shirt in that call. So anyways, as far as the call itself, the question that I decided to ask Chairman Gensler had to do with essentially in the community I was seeing this, what I perceived as a misconception, where people were under the impression that issuers could not directly encourage their shareholders to DRS through through things like perks or throwbacks, as is popular in other countries. And they also couldn't release more information about DRS than they were. And there was always this one rule that was being cited for that, which I'll send you a link to so that you can put it in the description if anyone wants to read it. But my reading of that rule essentially is that, and it's a fascinating read. It's I have it right here. I was going to quote. It's file number S72404. So catchy title, but essentially, it has to do with, there was a company called CMKM Diamond, which was, moving past all the context, they essentially tried to force their shareholders to move out of CD & Co. and to register with the transfer agent. And they were sending out missives, trying to communicate with their shareholders, saying like, you need to do this by X date or whatever. And, paraphrasing. Point being, it came down that, that was not okay. That, when you are trying to influence what your investors are doing with their share, with those beneficial entitlements that they own, you're trying to exercise authority over something that you don't actually have any authority on, because those are not your shares anymore. You sold them into the market, and those shareholders, they've got no relationship with you because they're entitled, they're beneficial owners. So it's not your business at all to be communicating with them in that way. Essentially, is how it came down. That want a more detailed analysis. I did write an article about this also on the website with a lot of quotes from the ruling, but in short, and in this moment, what I can share is that I think the perspective that it sounds a bit bizarre when you hear that the DTC is essentially saying and the SEC is agreeing that the issuer has no grounds to be trying to influence these people to hold in some other way. But the logic, as far as how it breaks out custodially with the central depository, is sound. And the way that it was interpreted by the community, at that time, as I was seeing, in my social media spaces, was this constant doom and gloom about how, and remember, so at this time, just very recently, GameStop had just started to release some DRS information. Very limited at first. They release a bit more now. But they just had started to release some information about DRS. And people were like, this is a big problem. They're going to get in such trouble, all this sort of thing. And so, and I understand maybe you'll have the clip, but long story short, I asked Chairman Gensler, what's going on here? Is this an issue? What are issuers allowed to say? What is going on with that? And can you speak to some of these concerns? And Chairman Gensler, probably more eloquently than I'll say here, essentially answered that it is totally fine, and issuers will release whatever information that they feel is materially important to their shareholders. That's pretty much where he left it. So, right. In a manner of speaking, what he said was, if you want more disclosure, then you need to make that clear to the companies. And so I think I asked, been a while, but I think I asked a follow-up question or something, and he said, well, so there's two companies that are releasing DRS information right now, which was GME and AMC. And he said, we're not doing anything about that.
Right. So he agreed. He said, look, they're allowed to do it. But I think that maybe a distinction is they're not allowed to incentivize people to go DRS, perhaps.
Well, I think that maybe is still a gray area, because there is no company currently in the U.S. markets that is providing a direct benefit for DRS. It's actually something that's common. The majority of other similar market structures where there's the central custodian and an option for direct registration, which is usually called something else. But essentially, they'll offer things like, your name is on our list of stockholders. Maybe you get a 5% discount when you order online. That kind of thing. So, in any case, right, we don't have an example of that right now. What the rule definitely does prohibit is a company saying, "Hey, investors, you need to DRS today." They can't do that. It needs to be an individual's choice, which I am in agreement with. I think it should be an individual's choice.
Yeah, no, totally. I think at least they're happy for the issuers to release some information to the shareholders, right? Love to hear any closing thoughts that you have.
Sure, well, I appreciate that. Love to be back anytime. And as far as closing thoughts, yes, I definitely do want to kind of wrap everything up in a bow as best that I can. I think that for me, DRS is something that is most likely to be appealing to long investors who have a desire to develop a relationship with some specific company or group of companies, in the medium to long term. And that the direct conversation and communication that is enabled through DRS are immeasurably valuable if you're someone who wants to send, a letter to the board or the proposals, or wants to be involved in shareholder democracy, or just simply wants to support the company that you're interested in. If you don't have any intention of selling, and you don't take advantage of other benefits of holding in a broker, then DRS can also make good sense, even if you don't intend to participate in those communication benefits. What you're still doing is removing shares from the central custodial system, which could have been used for locates based on the terms and service conditions of your broker agreement. You can protect the bottom line for your company as well in that way. And I think that is also valuable to remember. I would encourage anyone who is curious, of course, to check out ydrs.org. There's a bevy of resources that you can find on there, and I'm sure that I'll send over Ankit like a link so that you can find that in the description, along with some of the other rules and videos that were mentioned today. And I appreciate being here. I hope that it's sparked some curiosity in folks, not necessarily even just for yourself, but let your family know. Let any retirees in your family know, because again, items that are within these retirement vehicles or investment vehicles, there are ways to hold that are other than that. And I mean, yes, they're. I just wanted to kind of mention that it's wonderful to see people learning about this, and
100%.